Before I get into this discussion, major spoilers for a couple of shows are to follow. If you've not finished Mirai Nikki, Puella Magi Madoka Magica, The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, or Steins Gate, not to mention an assortment of Star Trek, Doctor Who, or Stargate episodes, well, I'm going to be at least touching on some mild spoilers if not major ones here, so consider yourself summarily warned. Hi there, I'm Raymond McNeil. Let's talk about some armchair pseudoscience, eh? Time travel has been a mainstay in the stable of science fiction story devices ever since H.G. Wells' 1895 story, The Time Machine, though there have been hints of time travel throughout religious scriptures, myths, legends, ever since the dawn of time. And time itself is an interesting concept that humanity has. Mitch Albom's book, The Timekeeper, has a pretty poetic quote about time, one that circulated around the internet enough for me to notice. It reads as follows. Try to imagine a life without timekeeping. You probably can't. You know the month, the year, the day of the week. There's a clock on your wall or the dashboard of your car. You have a schedule, a calendar, a time for dinner or a movie. Yet all around you, timekeeping is ignored. Birds are not late. A dog does not check its watch. Deer do not fret over the passing birthdays. Man alone measures time. Man alone chimes the hour. And because of this, man alone suffers a paralyzing fear that no other creature endures, a fear of time running out. This quote highlights a key nature of humanity. We're always rushing, always pushing ourselves in order to squeeze just a little bit more out of our lives before we die. We are aware that we are going to die, and that our number is coming, we just don't know when. When you take this concept into account, it makes sense that time travel would become a beautiful fantasy for humans to explore. The ability to supersede or extend that time limit, the ability to push back the clock, it's an innate human desire. And thus, it appears quite frequently in pop culture, though it's often derided as wishful thinking by highbrow critics. What is often ignored is that time travel is an incredibly difficult format of storytelling to actually make work, and this is in part, or maybe mostly because, of what is known as a paradox. The most basic to describe form of paradox is the grandfather paradox, the simple idea being that you go back in time and kill your own grandfather before your father is conceived, thus preventing you from existing in order to go back in time and killing your own grandfather in the first place. You create an inescapable loop that neither begins nor ends, it simply repeats ad infinitum. There are, of course, alternative theories to how time travel works. For example, the 1952 short story by Ray Bradbury, A Sound of Thunder, is one of the earliest recorded instances of alternate timelines, wherein your actions in the past don't affect the timeline that you originally came from. Instead, where you came from still exists in its original form, but as a trade-off, you yourself are now trapped in an alternate timeline that you have created thanks to your meddling in the past, which will change the future in an unknown way. The example made in A Sound of Thunder shows how crushing a butterfly back during the time of the dinosaurs accidentally and radically changes modern society, where English isn't spoken properly by the main character's recollection, and the politics of the world have shifted to a far more totalitarian state. There is yet another type of time travel that kind of wedges itself between the paradox theory and the alternate timeline theory, and that's one that I have dubbed the fate theory, wherein each event that happens in the past happens exactly as it's supposed to, your own interference included. A good example of this is Trials and Tribulations, an episode of Star Trek DS9. DS9 ran in the 90s, but on the 30th anniversary of Star Trek in general, the crew of the show were transported back to the time of the original series, during one of the primarily comedic episodes, The Trouble with Tribbles. The crew aren't treated as though they are changing the time streams thanks to the fact that they go through great pains to blend in and not directly change the events of the episode. They are depicted as having been there the entire time and simply overlooked during the original series' air date. Now, there's no confirmation what exact theory this follows, but since nothing seems to have changed in the slightest when they return home, it's safe to at least assume this is part of the fate theory, if not a very, very, very finely tweaked alternate timeline. There's a variation on the fate theory that pops up a little more often, but it's also a little more lenient wherein certain events are predetermined to happen, such as someone's death, or a terrorist attack, or someone giving birth. Some kind of temporally significant event where the actual time of occurrence will not change. The way it's more lenient is that there's more variation with the actual methods. Using those three previous examples, in one loop a person is hit by a car, where in another he is shot in the face. The terrorist attack blows up a building, or in another timeline it blows up a street corner. The birth will be a natural birth, or it'll be a cesarean section. The point is that the outcome is unavoidable. Someone will die, the terrorists will attack, that person is born, but the methods are always changing. There's also a number of issues that come up when it comes to the logistics of time travel and how time travel is achieved. One of the most common examples of this when time travel is addressed is the fact that Earth is not stationary. It revolves around the sun, it rotates on its own axis, and is still hurtling through space. And thus any device used for time travel would also have to double as some kind of teleporter, provided it's not some type of magic or something that doesn't require physical transportation. There's a whole gaggle of issues like this that crop up when you least expect them. If you're lost at this point, you'd be forgiven. I'm trying to outline these concepts as clearly as possible, but even I'm getting tongue-tied trying to follow everything I'm talking about. Even if you are following along fine, you can definitely see where this may lead to complications when writing a narrative around it. Time travel is messy. Every action that takes place in the past has to be taken into account in the future, and vice versa. This is where I find something like Back to the Future kind of falters. One thing that's massively glossed over in the films, that are often considered the pinnacle of time travel stories, is the lack of cohesive rules for time travel itself. The main driving force of Marty's interference with his mom and dad stems from the fact that he is slowly ceasing to exist, and if he doesn't correct the paradox he accidentally created in the first place, he will stop being. The general rules of paradox can be creatively changed, that's fine. Slowly ceasing to exist, while not quite logical, can be forgiven for the purposes of the story, whereas in actuality he would almost immediately cease to exist the minute he changed something that threatened his own existence. But then when he gets back to his own time, he seems to have created an alternate timeline wherein his father is more confident, his brother is a businessman, Biff is some kind of slave, and they even highlight the change with him mentioning a car crash that has now never happened. He should never have actually been at risk for ceasing to exist. And don't try to use the whole it was his own timeline argument, because it's not like the time stream revolves around the Traveler, as evidenced by the fact that Twin Pine Mall became Lone Pine Mall after he crushed that one tree, and Doc decided to wear a bulletproof vest. The butterfly effect is in full effect here, whereas the choices and interventions change the future. Hell, if you want to get more philosophical on this, one of the earlier logistical issues we could talk about is how Marty's family in this new timeline isn't his actual family. His life and their lives are radically different and share divergent memories that would soon expose that Marty was a time traveler. Or crazy, which, I mean, considering how people act in reality, is the more likely occurrence. This also raises the question of what happened to the Marty in the new timeline. The Marty we know apparently takes over his place, but if he didn't get this timeline's memories, that means there has to be another Marty out there with those memories, one who's jumped into the past and probably entered another timeline where his changes in the past came into effect. In that case, it has to be asked why Marty didn't run into that Marty during subsequent romps back to the 1960s. So it mixes both paradox theory and alternate timeline theory, but it doesn't do it smoothly, and it doesn't dwell on them either. And there's where we get to the heart of why I don't consider Back to the Future in any of its incarnations a good example of a time travel story. The time travel as a mechanic is secondary to the characters and the plot, whereas in other stories, time travel as a mechanism is influential on the narrative. This is the reason that Doctor Who, despite its prevalence, neo-mainstream appeal, and general approachability, will never be listed among the truly great time travel series. The rules they follow in each individual episode are usually consistent within that episode or story arc, but in the case of the entire series as a whole, it's largely inconsistent. The blanket excuse of wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey only serves to compound the issue. Now, I'm not saying the show is bad, because it's not. It's done some truly excellent episodes with the rules that it sets down for itself in the moment, and part of the appeal is that you don't have to necessarily think about the time travel while watching it. But when it comes time to judge a show for the quality of its time travel, Doctor Who isn't going to make it anywhere near the top of the list, thanks to the numerous times individual episodes contradict each other. Off the top of my head, I can name how the Waters of Mars from the Dr. 10 specials is directly contradicted by the Impossible Astronaut and the Wedding the River song in Series 6. Truly great time travel stories work in cohesion with logical rules, in the weakest cases established by the universe of the story, or in the best cases established by our own world's philosophical and scientific musings on the subject. Very often, the best explorations of time travel come in the form of one-off episodes or story arcs from shows entrenched in science fiction or fantasy. Stargate and Star Trek are lousy with time travel episodes, each of which establish their own rules and consistencies, and very often, those episodes are later referenced in continuity whenever another temporal event occurs. Some truly beautiful episodes came out of Star Trek, like The City on the Edge of Forever, which dealt with the struggle of trying to prevent themselves from changing the timeline, while also struggling with the moral dilemma of letting a good person die in trying to do so. Or the aforementioned Trials and Tribulations, where the crew are integrated into the timeline naturally. Similarly, who could forget the episode Window of Opportunity from Stargate SG-1, where Colonel O'Neill and Teal'c get trapped in a temporal loop. During one point of which, O'Neill begins golfing through the Stargate itself, which is one of the funniest moments in science fiction altogether. Sometimes the episodes are played for laughs, sometimes for character development, and sometimes to expand the lore, but the important thing to take away from these examples is that the nature of internal consistency within the shows themselves. Each point where time travel is introduced in these shows, there's usually a different mechanism that facilitates the temporal transition, meaning that the rules of the time travel are actually changed dependent upon the plot device's intention. And whenever that same device is brought up a second time, its rules maintain internal consistency, unlike, say, the TARDIS in Doctor Who, where the rules fluctuate greatly from episode to episode. Which leads me into longer form time travel tales, where the element of time travel is at least present in a consistent form, if not present as the crux of the entire story. Now, I should note before going on that I was going to have a small section here about Majora's Mask that I was going to talk about here, but I decided against it on the grounds that I have not personally played through the game, and it's been quite some time since I've watched a full playthrough, so my grasp of the temporal mechanics are not what they need to be in this instance. I do wish to direct people to it though, as I do recall it being a very good translation of time travel in a video game medium. Hell, I recently picked up Consortium, and that's another game that really makes good use of time travel as a game mechanic. Sort of. It's hard to describe, and trying to do so would taper your experience. Get it on Steam, it's only like $12 and it's well worth your time, despite some of the janky mechanics it has going on. But back on track, there are some really great stories out there where time travel lies at the heart of the issue. Haruhi is a good example of one where time travel plays an integral role and maintains consistency, but it's not the focus of the story. The idea of Kyon traveling into the past with the help of Mikuru in order to help Haruhi become the wonderful young woman we all know and love sits at the heart of both Haruhi as a character and Kyon as an agent of his own destiny. The show leaves the method of time travel that Mikuru uses and the bizarre world manipulations that Yuki Nagato uses vague in order to facilitate the story, but it always implies that there is far more going on beyond our knowledge, keeping the time streams in check. The rules of fate time travel are almost universally adhered to, with the exception of Yuki Nagato, who is able to directly manipulate the fabric of time to produce an alternate timeline, one from which Kyon has to inevitably end up escaping from. Normally, a lack of explanation can be detrimental to a series, especially one playing with such serious devices, but in this instance, the way everything is plotted and planned allows the audience enough of a peek behind the curtain to have their curiosity sated, but leave them in the dark enough so that certain elements can be tweaked without notice. However, again like Doctor Who and Back to the Future, the time travel isn't the focus, merely a background driving force. What elevates Haruhi above those two as a time travel story is its own internal consistency. Puella Magi Madoka Magica and Mirai Nikki, on the other hand, are two stories where the entirety of the series is based upon the crux of the time travel present, and in fact, it's used in very similar ways. In Mirai Nikki, Yuno, the principal female character, creates an alternate timeline by traveling into the past from the first timeline into a second timeline, killing her temporal duplicate and taking her duplicate's place. It stands out because oftentimes in stories, characters who travel back in time try to avoid coming in contact with themselves, trying to force a fate timeline. But in this, the idea of killing and replacing yourself in the past in order to relive events is a rather new notion and one perfectly executed by the team. If there's only one downside to Mirai Nikki's time travel, it's that the third timeline that's created is almost too perfect, and the series of events leading to that perfection seem almost too good to be true. The happy ending that the characters enjoy isn't usually something that's usually enjoyed in a time travel series, and it does knock some of the plausibility from the story. But that's more of a fault of the story and less of the actual mechanics of the time travel itself, which is simple enough that there's really no flaw in it, which is a very smart way to play it. Madoka Magica was a little more complex, though it alleviated some of the issues by having the time travel be mostly mental. Homura, the arguable main character of the series at this point, watches her best friend Madoka die and makes a wish in order to essentially repeat their meeting until she can save Madoka from dying. The motivation is similar to Yuno's, though the method is notably different. Homura travels back mentally, though her magic lets her retain her existence as a magical girl. She doesn't have to replace herself, she simply continues from that point going forward and jumps back whenever she fails to save Madoka, effectively putting her in a Groundhog Day loop of her own creation. An interesting complexity actually pops up because of these two types of time travel, and is only partially addressed in Madoka Magica. It's the same complaint I had about Back to the Future, only in this case it adds depth to the time travel and the characters as opposed to being glossed over. Yuno and Homura are meeting different people every single time they travel back into the past. Homura more so because she actually jumps through thousands of time loops. Yuno meeting, befriending, and falling in love with the main character Yuki is Yuno falling in love with someone who is divergent from the original Yuki she knew in the original timeline. The same applies to Homura and Madoka. Yuno and Homura may be meeting two of the same base people, but every event that occurs after they make it back to the past is under the effect of the butterfly effect, and changes the behavior of those around them, ranging from base personality traits to full character development. Hell, there are entire mangas dedicated to the failed timelines from Madoka Magica. For all intents and purposes, the Madoka that Homura befriended and fell in love with is dead and isn't coming back. This is actually part of the realization that Homura has before she begins to change into a witch at the end of the series. But the one series I think encapsulates time travel in its entire essence has to be Steins Gate, which not only uses time travel to inform the plot, but also takes a hard pseudoscience edge to the methodology and lore of time travel itself. The series alone covers 3 divergent types of time travel and how they each affect the flow of time. The way the audience is informed on the exact changes is through the gift of the main character Okabe has, one he calls his reading Steiner, which allows him to maintain his own consistent thoughts and memories even as the universe around him changes. It's also implied that it's not necessarily a gift he has alone, that anyone could have it, but for the purposes of the plot, he is the only one who truly remembers. The initial form of time travel is through text messages labeled D-mails after the DeLorean from Back to the Future. These messages are sent into the past to themselves in order to inform their past selves on critical events that end up changing the future. These changes create alternate timelines, called world lines in the show, and Okabe is the only person who actually remembers sending the D-mails at all. At a future date, the crew figure out how to send minds back in time, which Okabe finds useful when one of his loved ones is killed by a shady organization looking to steal his time travel research. Okabe proceeds to trap himself, much like Homura, into an infinite loop within the same timeline, which is actually a rather interesting, unusual, and important fact. This form of time travel doesn't actually jump Okabe into a different world line. He himself is merely going back to the beginning of the world line he is currently in. Eventually, Okabe manages to revert himself back to the original world line, however due to a time travel plot shenanigan, he needs to push his past self into the spiraling chaos of the entire series in order to prevent a paradox, while also saving the life of another one of his loved ones. In order to do this, he finally achieves physical time travel and goes into the past himself, and here is where the genius of the show lies. Time travel is treated as a form of affecting the past, but how the past is affected is important. The D-mails sent back information that influenced decisions made by the characters that created alternate world lines. Sending a mind back did not create a new world line, merely repeating a world line ad infinitum where certain events were destined to happen. And sending an entire physical entity back in time created a window within the same world line where either a paradox could be created or avoided while also changing events, but not the way they were perceived. What I just laid out was a gloss over. The amount of actual detail that the writers of Steins Gate put into their universe's time travel is absolutely staggering. It's even more staggering to hear that in the original visual novel, they go into several theoretical forms of time travel present in the scientific community, even going so far as to debunk 2 of them. Now you might be wondering, what is the point of this video, and I've been mostly evasive on that angle because this is very personal to me. I see people write off Steins Gate as, that was good. But to me, it's an insane achievement in the world of science fiction, at least in the cinematic mediums. Do you know how many science fiction novels there are out there? Hell if I'm reading all of them. This show is lauded by some, but in my honest opinion, it should be enshrined not only in the halls of anime, but in shows in general for the way it deftly maneuvers around 3 different forms of time travel almost simultaneously, without creating paradoxes, without creating contradictions, without breaking character, and certainly without breaking pace. There are other amazing things about the show too, and there are admittedly some faults in it, but that's not what I'm here to cover. I didn't come here just to gush about Steins Gate though, or Puella Magi Madoka Magica, or Mirai Nikki. What I came here to do was basically highlight what I believed are the criteria of a good time travel story. Internal and external consistency of the rules and mechanics, relevance and impact on the plot, used not only to further develop the story but also the characters. So often I see time travel used as a plaything in film and TV and novels. It's my opinion that the subgenre needs to be given a little more praise when it's executed in new and brilliant, unique ways. That all said, you might have a differing opinion, so please feel free to post them down in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you have to say, so long as it's said in a calm and genial manner. You know, I kind of feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh no. Hey there! If you liked the video, please hit that like button down below, or even leave a message in the comments. If you're interested in more content like this, check out the rest of the channel, as well as our Facebook page and my Twitter handle. If you'd like updates on our newest content, hit that subscribe button so our news of our most recent work reaches you as fast as possible. And if you're feeling especially generous today, please check out our Patreon page. Keep in mind, full-length videos get released there at least 2 days prior to being made public. It's thanks to you, our faithful fans and followers, that we can make the content that we love. Please keep up that support, and as always, we'll catch you on the flip side.